This is ILTV on the hour. We are live here in Israel, bringing you the biggest headlines from the region. It's currently 2 p.m. here in Israel and 7 a.m. in New York. I'm Deborah Klein, and today is day 678 of the war in Gaza. Let's get into all of the top headlines at this hour. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich has announced a housing project to take shape in the controversial E1 area in Judea and Samaria. According to the White Wing minister, 3,400 housing units will be built in a project that had been planned for many years but never executed due to its strategic location in between Samaria in the north and Judea in the south. The project has been frozen for decades amid fierce opposition from the international community, for fear the new settlement neighborhood would block a potential viable Palestinian state. But now, with many Western countries announcing that they are slated to recognize a Palestinian state come September, despite the fact that Hamas still holds Israeli hostages captive, the right-wing minister decided that now is the time to push forward with the project. Smotrich called this project Zionism at its best, building, settling, and strengthening our sovereignty in the land of Israel. Now, Israel is at the forefront of the fight against savagery and barbarism. That's the message from Prime Minister Netanyahu as he addressed the Newsmax American Independence celebration in Jerusalem last night. Netanyahu confirmed that he called the pro-Hamas sentiment on American college campuses, claiming that the students there are falling victim to Hamas propaganda. With that, the Israeli Prime Minister thanked the integrity of honest journalism and stressed the shared values of Israel and the United States. Have a listen.
So now we have the capacity to physically defend the Jewish state, but we now have to muster all the forces that seek to defend our common civilization against this mutilation of the truth that threatens our common future. And that's why I salute Newsmax and others who stand together, stand up for the truth, are not cowed, can speak their mind, can show the facts, can stand up for our common humanity and for our common future. And if you're not ready in this day and age, especially in this day and age, to fight for freedom, you will lose it. If you do not fight for your civilization, you will lose it. We are prepared to fight, and I know America is prepared to stand with us, and I salute you for doing the same. Thank you. Thank you all.
Strong words from the Prime Minister there. And joining us now to discuss all of this and more is Brigadier General in the Reserves, Yossi Kupperwasser of the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Affairs. Yossi, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Not from the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Affairs, from Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Yes.
Absolutely. That's my bad. So, I have to start with a very big question. And, I think our viewers abroad could actually use some clarity. Netanyahu has said time and again that we are, quote, a breath away from total victory. But he's been saying that for quite some time now. And it feels like we're always just a step away from beating Hamas. So as a former general yourself, in your opinion, what would it take for Israel to actually be close to ending the war? Do you even see an end to the war in sight?
Yes, I think that the decision of the cabinet to take over the rest of Gaza is the final move that would bring us closer to the end of the war. The problem was until now that we never decided to win the war. We decided to get everything we want without winning the war. We believe that we shall be able to put enough pressure on Hamas for them to give up their arms and release the hostages without us actually defeating them finally and taking over the rest of the territory. But of course, from Hamas' point of view, as long as we didn't make this decision, they had their safety net, the fact that they were always going to rule over Gaza, whatever happens. And that's why they were able to delay the decision-making of their own and refuse to accept the deals that were presented to them. And I think that now that there is a decision, that puts a lot of pressure on Hamas. And we see the fact that they have sent the delegation back to Cairo to discuss the matters. And they realize that, the most dangerous thing that can happen to Hamas is that the population itself removes it from power by some sort of a revolution. And the population is not that far away from doing that, but the chances of this happening because of their fears is very low. It's not impossible, but it's low. But the chance, and they thought that they can manage that, and they can also manage the second worst development, which is that Israel will remove them from power by force, because they believe that Israel is not inclined to take control over Gaza and to rule over Gaza and over the population of Gaza. And there was a reasonable assumption on their behalf, because Israel really believed that it can win the war without doing that. But what the cabinet decided was that, well, we ran out of the ideas that are short of taking over Gaza in order to win the war, and now we're really going to win the war. This puts Hamas in a very difficult situation, and that I hope it's going to have an impact on their decision making. We have to remember at the same time that there are others who try to convince Hamas not to take any decision, like the Europeans, for example, and the other Western countries that give them all kinds of prizes that they do not deserve, and make the impression that they can stay in power. And this is something that's really, really disturbing, and maybe harden their hearts when they come to make this decision. But that's why we have to decide to move forward and make sure that they understand that we are determined to do that.
So
if we are,
I just want to clarify then that you're basically saying that now we actually are as close as we've ever been to ending this war, that all the times beforehand that Netanyahu has given, in press releases to the international media saying that we're nearing the end, this time it's for real?
It seems that it is for real. The military has prepared plans to perform and implement the decision of the cabinet. Militarily speaking, coming back to your original question, militarily speaking, it's not such a big mission. It's not such a big challenge, because the IDF can take over Gaza City within a couple of weeks, and it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. It's, of course, full with terrorists that are deployed there, and probably several thousands of them are there. And if they decide to fight until the last terrorist, then it's going to be difficult. But taking over the territory itself is not that complicated and can be done.
It's interesting that you say that. And, I want to ask you also about the ongoing issue of humanitarian aid, because it's an ongoing issue, and it's crystal clear that Hamas is stealing and looting anything that enters the Strip. And yet, despite that, Kogat is facilitating the entry of tons of aid by truck and by air, the whole lot, knowing that Hamas is taking the aid and probably using it for terror purposes or, for themselves to gather more strength. Do you agree with the aid operation? And if you don't, how harmful is it to the Israeli military operation in trying to end the war, if at all?
It is harmful, just as the support they get from the Western countries, it's harmful as well. And it is harmful because, as you can see in these pictures, they loot according to the UN agencies, they loot something like close to 90% of the humanitarian aid that's coming in, and that's a problem. But still, 10% reaches the population, and whatever the number of humanitarian aid convoys that we allow in, 10%. The more we bring in, the 10% is bigger. So it makes sense to allow this in. We are not going to win the war in Gaza by depriving Hamas from food and other materials they need. We shall have to fight. And that's clear right now. At the same time, the legitimacy we have to carry out this operation is going to be bigger if we allow this humanitarian aid coming in. And that's why we need to do that. And on top of that, I think that once we decide to move forward, we have to make sure that the first step would be trying at least to evacuate the population, the civilians, out of the areas of battle, and moving them to areas where they, first of all, they can be safer, and secondly, the areas where they can have the humanitarian aid reaching them, not looted by Hamas. So the first move should be the effort to help the population move to safer and better places. We shall have to prepare places like that in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Mm-hmm. I'm sure it's part of the plan.
And when you say, international legitimacy and basically the international community and their opinions on Israel, if these moves are to appease the international community, then why does it seem that time and again Israel gets no backing from the international community? In fact, is criticized repeatedly by the international community. So why do you think that the IDF, the Israeli military and security officials, are making sure that there is international legitimacy in all of the things, all the operations that are conducted inside the Gaza Strip, when in practice it seems almost futile, really?
Well, there are many layers to explain of the explanation of why this is happening. First of all, there is a disagreement about the conditions put forward by the Israeli government to who is going to distribute the aid. The international community doesn't want Israel to distribute the aid directly or through the Americans, the American company GHF. They want to be in charge of distributing the aid, and they are unhappy with the fact that we divested some of the humanitarian aid to the GHF. Secondly, we insist that organizations that have terrorists within their ranks are not going to be involved in this humanitarian activity, because we know that this is going to be directly going to Hamas and other terror groups. And we were trying to make sure that such organizations that have terrorists within their ranks are not going to be involved in this effort. And this caused a lot of disagreements between us and the UN agencies and other agencies that are involved in this aid distribution. And thirdly, there are all kinds of reasons that are more problematic from our point of view, which is the attitude of the Europeans and the international community to the Palestinians. Their effort is focused on improving the living conditions of the Palestinians, ignoring the security impact that can have on Israel's interest and Israel's security. And they do not attribute any importance, for example, to improving the situation or doing something about the hostages. This is something that's just lip service from their point of view.
Absolutely, and I actually,
we see how difficult.
I do want to pivot to the hostages for a minute before we run out of time, because the IDF controls a huge chunk of the Gaza Strip right now. Where are Hamas? But more importantly, where are the hostages? It was said when the IDF entered Deir el-Balach at the time, it's almost a month ago if I'm not wrong, that the hostages are likely there because the IDF had not yet been operating there. But it's been almost a month and we still haven't heard much. Do you think that at this point the hostages could be underground or somewhere else, or perhaps are the IDF, do you think the IDF might know where they are but is specifically not approaching them because they might be at risk?
Well, the IDF, in my mind, knows more than we know about the whereabouts of the hostages. Mm-hmm. And most of them are in areas populated by the Palestinians, and we don't control areas that are populated by the Palestinians. We don't control the populated area of Deir el-Balach. We don't control the refugee camps of the central area of Gaza, the Marazi, Nuseirat. We don't control these areas, and there are many of the hostages, in my mind, are kept over there. And we don't control Gaza City, where some of the hostages are still kept in captivity over there. So it's not in the areas we control, because we don't control the population. Now, where exactly, if they are in tunnels, or some of them were in tunnels, we saw the video clips. Some of them are probably held above ground with safe places that Hamas is prepared for that purpose. And we have to remember, we are talking about a relatively small number today. It's 20 living hostages that are still kept in the hands of Hamas and other organizations operating in the terror organizations operating in the Gaza Strip. It's not such a huge number as it was in the beginning. So it's not that difficult to keep them. And anyhow, Israel is going to be very careful not to attack the areas where they are kept, and definitely not to carry out military operations that can endanger their lives. So they feel, Hamas feels relatively safe in holding them, and still we see how they treat them. It's really terrible to see what they've done to them.
Absolutely heart-wrenching, I agree. And, I want to also go back to the international community, which is something that we touched on. We touched on the international community really giving Hamas this sort of, this prize, I think you called it, by saying that they'll recognize a Palestinian state come September, even though they're still holding our hostages, and that puts Israel in a deadlock position. Hamas knows at this point that the hostages are their insurance policy because they can continue holding them, causing the IDF to continue operations because, as we stated, we won't stop until we get the hostages back, causing a reaction from the international community. So, just before we wrap up here, I do want to ask you, do you see any viable way for Israel to get out of this horrible, never-ending cycle? Can this war come to an end on Israel's terms?
Yes, it can. We have to be very determined in what we do and put more and more pressure on Hamas until we are really able to force them out of Gaza. And the way they should be forced out of Gaza safely is if they release the hostages. That's, in my mind, the idea that the Israeli government has in mind. And if you bring Hamas to the point where the physical survival is going to be dependent on releasing the hostages, maybe we can make a deal at that point. And we see that, as I said in the beginning, that when they realize that Israel means business and it's going to actually carry out this operation and remove them from power by force, they have sent a delegation to Egypt because they don't want to be ousted in a way that is clearly seen as a defeat. We have to remember the question at stake is, was the 7th of October a good idea from the point of view of the Palestinians? And we have to prove to the Palestinians that it was a bad idea. And Hamas is fighting in order to prove that it was a good idea. And if they are going to be ousted by force from Gaza and lose Gaza, with all the devastation and the destruction that you have over there, it's going to be very difficult to claim that the 7th of October was a good idea. And that's the claim right now. We saw Razi Hamad looking at the decision of the French and the other governments to recognize Palestine and saying, see, these are the results of the 7th of October. We'll see what a brilliant idea it was to carry out this attack. So we have to make sure that everybody knows that it was a bad idea. And in order to save their lives, they can release the hostages, and we should spare their lives and allow them to live safely in the Gaza Strip.
That's interesting that you say that. I actually do want to keep you on for a bit longer if I could, because what is stopping Hamas, or whatever is left from Hamas, when we reach some sort of so-called end to this war? What's stopping Hamas from coming in and saying, oh yeah, October 7th and that was a good idea, and everything that happened afterwards and all the generational trauma that all of the survivors, all of the Gazan survivors will now be living through, the trauma? How can they not pin that on Israel and basically say this is all Israel's fault and indoctrinate a new generation and raise the new Hamas terrorists?
Well, everybody who has a brain in his mind, in his head, even if he is a Palestinian looking around and judging the 7th of October, would tell you that it was a bad idea if they lose the war. And we have to make them lose the war. If they don't lose the war, they would say, well, this was a sacrifice that was justified. We harmed the Israeli self-confidence. We created a situation which allowed the terrorists out of the Israeli jails. We are going to have reconstruction. And yes, many people lost their lives and many houses were destroyed, but we can reconstruct the houses, and new babies are going to be born, and those who lost their lives are going to paradise anyhow. So it's not such a bad idea. But if they lose control of Gaza, which is their main asset, and all this devastation happens, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to convince anybody on the Palestinian side that this was a good idea. And they understand it. This is why they keep fighting.
Mm-hmm. Brigadier General Yossi Kupperwasser, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, could Iran attack Israel in the coming weeks? Israeli security officials have warned Israelis to keep a cautious stance and follow the guidelines, as a surprise attack could be imminent. This announcement is leaning, of course, on Israeli intelligence picked up from within Iran. But as the regime continues to target Israel with its resources, the Iranian people continue to suffer under this oppressive regime. Joining us now to discuss, to give us the much-needed Iranian perspective, is Jonathan Harounoff, a British-Iranian journalist and author of his new book, Unveiled, Inside Iran's #Women, Life, Freedom, Revolt. Jonathan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on, Devo.
Absolutely. So, earlier this week, Netanyahu actually addressed the Iranian people, encouraging them to rise up against their regime. It's obvious that we are way overdue for regime change, and many countries like Israel would likely back the Iranians should they choose to topple the regime. So, Jonathan, could you shed some light for us on why this is so-called uprising hasn't happened just yet?
We've seen in the past 46 years of the Islamic Republic's history, wave after wave of uprising, and they haven't always happened at times that are completely predictable. They usually coincide with moments of where the Islamic Republic is facing extreme weakness militarily, is vulnerable, but when it's also facing quite a lot of social, domestic discontent. So now is especially a fraught time because, as you mentioned in your introduction, with these intelligence reports coming out that the Islamic Republic is perhaps planning another attack on Israel and its allies, and is continuing to focus on its nuclear program and all of these expensive things that do divert resources outside of the country. Inside Iran, there's absolute devastation. There's severe water shortages, gas and electricity shortages, and people are really struggling to survive. Even the country's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, warned that there could be a chance that by September or October, most of the water in the country's dams would simply run out. And these are like extremely dangerous times. And during these extremely difficult times, rather than focus on, improving the lives of the people inside Iran dealing with these very existential issues, instead they're focusing on potentially attacking Israel and continuing to build nuclear programs, continuing to arm and support proxies. Imagine an alternative reality where, in a post-Ayatollah era, where Iran didn't focus on these things. Think back to the time of 1962, where there was a very devastating earthquake in the city of Qasvin in Iran. And what happened? There was a massive, devastating earthquake, and the Shah, preceding the Khomeini and the Ayatollahs, allowed Israeli water engineers to travel to Iran and to advise on efforts to aid reconstruction and improve efficiency. Imagine a world today where there wasn't all of this animosity and this desire to annihilate the state of Israel, and there was actual collaboration, especially in terms of water technology and things like that. But the Islamic Republic has shown time and time again that it's not interested in the lives of improving the lives of ordinary Iranians, and is certainly not interested in the lives of Israelis.
Absolutely. And we've actually just had an update of the last few hours where Netanyahu supposedly offered this water tech to the Iranian people as a response to the water shortage. And the response of Masoud Pezeshkian, the president of the Islamic regime in Iran, was he called it a mirage. He said he obviously tied it to what's happening in Gaza and claiming that Israel is not providing water to Gaza, which we know is false. But that mirage comment, it's not just that he's not interested in accepting Israeli tech, he's opposing it. What does that sort of reaction feel like as an Iranian and for Iranians in the country right now?
When I was writing this book, Unveiled, I spent 3 years speaking to Iranians inside Iran and in the diaspora, people who have very, the 90 million plus people inside Iran who have very different, most of them have very different viewpoints to the Islamic Republic. And I'm sure if you would have asked, the press would have asked the people of Iran what they want, would they want to be in a continued perpetual state of war, tension with their neighbors, or if they'd want peace? I'm sure even if it's not for political, ideological reasons, they would opt for the latter. They would opt for peace to improve their own lives. And I don't think it's entirely surprising that the clerical leadership and the president obviously going to refuse that offer. But the people of Iran, from what I can tell, would have a very different view.
Mm-hmm. And, I have to ask you, just on the heels of that, do you think that there could perhaps be more that the international community could do for the Iranian people? I mean, this is clearly a predicament that you and I are able to recognize, and a lot of people as well. So could the Iranians perhaps be receiving more support?
There's a specific kind of support that I think the Iranian people want from the international community. They don't want extra foreign interference meddling in the day-to-day affairs of the country. But what they want is expressions of support, expressions of solidarity, and quite the opposite of interference. They want their Western governments and international community to stop cooperating, collaborating with the Islamic Republic. They want them to stop trading with the Islamic Republic. They want them to, implement the sanctions that have been imposed on the Islamic Republic. And I work at the United Nations now for Israel, and we've got a very interesting couple of months coming up with the snapbacks looming and the potential reimposition of the sanctions that were imposed on the Islamic Republic 10 years ago at the signing of the JCPOA. So these are the kinds of things that I think the people of Iran want. They want their regime to be weakened, and to give them an opportunity to rise up. And we don't need the international community doesn't need to do the second half of rising up. The people of Iran know how to do that and have shown that they've done that time and time again in 2009 with the Green Revolution, 17, 18, the economic challenges, 2022, 2023 with the Women Life Freedom Movement. And also right before the 12-day war, we saw massive nationwide trucker protests because people had really had enough. And it's only a matter of time with these water shortages showing no sign of receding, that the people of Iran are going to rise again.
Absolutely. And, we do have to wrap up soon, but I just wanted to ask you one more question because you serve as Israel's international spokesperson at the UN. The war of public opinion is one of Israel's weakest fronts in this war. And yet it's always the Iranian people out of everyone who can see straight through the Hamas propaganda coming out of Gaza. No other nation is able to understand what they are consuming is propaganda, but the Iranian people always do. What's your take on that? Why do you think it is that they're able to see through these propaganda tactics that we know so well from Hamas?
I think it's because of a number of reasons. First of all, because the Islamic Republic is not the Iranian people. They're two very different things. And the two groups that have suffered the most at the hands of the Islamic Republic are the Iranian people, of course, who've been arrested, disappeared, executed, suppressed for 46 years, and the people of Israel, who've been attacked directly and also indirectly through the proxies. So they both have this sort of affinity, and much beyond that, beyond the suffering. Before 1979, there was a lot of collaboration. There's a sort of historical amnesia that many observers just continue to live in, where there was a time before 1979 where Israel and Iran did have fruitful relations, when there were even sort of clandestine meetings being held between Israel's Prime Minister Ben-Gurion and some subsequent leaders and Iran's leaders as well. Seems unthinkable, but this really did happen. There was a collaboration on academia, agriculture, trade, all sorts of things, and that's really a lost history. So I think that's why the people of Iran see right through a lot of the propaganda, because they've lived it. They can see through all of that stuff that other people who haven't lived through it and just read the headlines, read the tweets, don't have that context.
Absolutely. And Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss these very important topics. And I also want to encourage our viewers that these topics also exist in your new book, Unveiled, which you can now also go and find as well. Jonathan, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And just before we wrap up, I want to remind our viewers that there is a heat wave here in Israel. Today, 2 people lost their lives due to the heat waves. A 70-year-old man in a lot collapsed from a heat stroke and died, and another 60-year-old man in Rishon LeZion. EMTs and paramedics arrived at the scene of the man who had collapsed from heat stroke and were unable to resuscitate him. They were unfortunately forced to announce his death. Israeli medical and safety personnel continue reminding the public to take the necessary precautions as this heat wave is ramping up and reaching record-breaking temperatures. Well, that is a wrap for all of the top headlines of the hour. We are currently live in Israel. We're giving you all of the relevant updates from the Middle East. But in the meantime, you can scan the QR code that's on your screen. Check out our ILTV app. We have more updates coming for you guys all day on the hour. I'm Devo Klein. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.